in the year 476. For centuries, the Roman Empire had ruled much of the known world, but on this quiet year, its western half simply stopped existing. One of the greatest empires in human history quietly disappeared. There was no final trumpet, no great explosion, no single moment when the world suddenly changed. Instead, the Western Roman Empire simply faded away. Across the land once known as Gaul, the place that would one day become France, Roman officials slowly vanished from their posts. The great roads still crossed the countryside. Stone bridges still spanned the rivers. Cities still stood behind their ancient walls. But something had changed. The powerful system that once connected these places was gone. And yet, life did not suddenly collapse. Farmers still worked their fields. Small villages still gathered beside wooden churches. Travelers still followed the old Roman roads between distant towns. To most people living in Gaul, the end of the empire did not feel like the end of the world. It felt more like a slow turning of the seasons. One age fading, another quietly beginning. Before we continue, you might want to dim the lights around you, settle into a comfortable position, and allow the room to grow a little quieter. Take a slow breath and let the noise of the day drift away. Tonight, we are going to travel slowly through the long history of France, from the quiet villages that appeared after the fall of Rome, to the rise of kings and castles, to the glittering halls of Versailles and the distant echoes of revolution and empire. But there is no need to hurry. History moves slowly here. And if you enjoy calm journeys through history like this one, you might consider subscribing to the channel. Many listeners return to these stories in the evening, to relax, to learn something new, or simply to drift into sleep. And subscribing helps this peaceful corner of history continue to grow. Now, take another slow breath, settle in, and let the long, gentle story of France begin. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the land of Gaul did not suddenly fall into chaos. At first glance, much of the Roman world still remained. Stone roads still stretched across the countryside. Travelers still walked those roads, but they no longer walked inside an empire. Bridges built centuries earlier still crossed wide rivers. Cities still stood behind their ancient defensive walls, and in many towns, daily life continued almost as it always had. Yet beneath this familiar surface, something important had begun to change. The powerful system that once connected these places was slowly fading away. For generations, Roman officials had governed towns throughout Gaul. They collected taxes, they enforced laws, and they maintained order across large territories. Messages traveled across the empire through an organized network of roads and couriers. But after the collapse of imperial authority in the West, these systems began to weaken. Governors disappeared from many cities. Imperial orders no longer arrived from distant capitals. And local communities gradually began to rely on themselves. Without the constant presence of Roman administration, town leaders took on greater responsibility. Local landowners helped protect nearby villages, and regional leaders began making decisions once handled by imperial officials. In some places, Roman traditions continued for many years, but slowly, a new political landscape began to emerge. One shaped less by distant emperors and more by local rulers. The cities of Roman Gaul still contained impressive buildings. Large stone forums stood in the center of many towns. Bathhouses built during earlier centuries still stood beside busy streets. Warehouses lined the rivers where merchants once traded goods from across the empire. But many of these buildings slowly changed their purpose. Without the wealth and organization of the Roman state, some structures fell into disrepair. Others were reused in practical ways. A former administrative hall might become a marketplace. An old Roman building might become part of a church. The physical remains of Rome were still visible everywhere. Yet, the civilization that had built them was gradually disappearing. The great Roman road system continued to connect the region. These roads were among the greatest achievements of ancient engineering. They stretched across hills and valleys in straight lines. Stone surfaces allowed travelers to move efficiently across long distances. Milestones marked the path between important cities. But as time passed, the roads grew quieter. Fewer soldiers marched along them. Fewer government officials traveled between towns. Instead, most travelers were merchants, pilgrims, or villagers visiting nearby markets. The roads still connected Gaul, but the empire they once served had faded. Trade also changed during these years. Under Roman rule, goods had traveled across vast distances. Wine from southern regions, olive oil from Mediterranean lands, fine pottery from distant provinces. But as imperial connections weakened, trade networks grew smaller. Markets focused more on local goods. Nearby farms supplied food. Local craftsmen produced tools and pottery. The economy became more regional, more closely tied to the surrounding countryside. Beyond the towns and roads, the natural landscape remained calm and enduring. Forests covered large areas of Gaul. Rivers flowed steadily toward the sea. Fields stretched across valleys where farmers had cultivated crops for generations. For many ordinary people, life did not change suddenly. The fall of Rome was not experienced as a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was a slow transformation. Year by year, the old world quietly gave way to a new one. Across this changing land, new groups of people were gaining influence. Among them were the Franks. For generations, the Franks had lived along the northern frontiers of the Roman world. Some had fought against Roman armies. Others had served within them. Many had settled inside the borders of Gaul. They farmed land. They traded with nearby towns. And over time, their leaders began to gain power. As Roman authority faded, these local rulers became increasingly important. Small territories formed around strong leaders. Alliances developed between different groups. And gradually, the political map of Gaul began to change. Yet, despite these shifts in power, life across much of the land remained peaceful. Villages continued their daily routines. Farmers planted crops in the spring. Harvests were gathered in autumn. Families gathered beside evening fires during the long winter months. The countryside moved according to the quiet rhythm of the seasons. To the people living through these years, the world did not feel like the dramatic end of an empire. It felt more like a gentle turning of time. One age fading slowly into the past, another beginning to take shape. And in the villages and fields of Gaul, the foundations of medieval France were quietly forming. While the Roman political system slowly faded, life in the countryside followed a quieter and older rhythm. Most people in Gaul did not live in cities. Instead, they lived in small villages scattered across forests and valleys. A typical village was not large. Perhaps a dozen homes stood together. A few barns and storage sheds stood nearby. At the center, there was often a small church. Simple paths of packed earth connected the buildings. Beyond the village, fields stretched outward into the surrounding countryside. The houses themselves were modest. Wooden beams formed the structure. The walls were made from woven branches covered with clay. Roofs were thatched with straw. Inside, the space was small but warm. A fire burned in the center of the room. The soft glow of the flames flickered against the wooden walls. Outside, the village slowly disappeared into darkness. Smoke slowly drifted upward through a small opening in the roof. Families gathered around this fire in the evenings. They shared food. They spoke quietly about the work of the day. And outside, the countryside rested beneath the dark sky. Morning often began before sunrise. The village slowly stirred as the eastern sky began to grow pale. Animals needed to be fed. Tools needed to be prepared. Farmers stepped out into the cool morning air and walked toward their fields. Most people depended on farming for their survival. Fields of wheat and barley covered the valleys. Vegetable gardens grew beside the houses. Small orchards produced fruit during the warmer months. The work of caring for these crops shaped nearly every part of daily life. Spring brought the season of planting. The soil softened after the long winter. Wooden plows pulled by oxen turned the earth. Seeds were scattered carefully across the fields. Farmers watched the skies and the weather closely. A good growing season meant safety and comfort. A poor harvest could bring hunger. Summer brought long days of labor. The sun rose early and remained high for many hours. Farmers worked steadily in the fields. Shepherds guided sheep across open hills. Children helped carry water or gather vegetables from nearby gardens. Travelers sometimes passed along the dusty roads between villages. Merchants with small wagons. Pilgrims walking long distances toward holy places. Messengers carrying news from distant towns. Autumn was the most important season of the year. It was the time of harvest. Villagers worked together to gather the crops. Grain was cut and bundled in the fields. Fruit was collected from orchards. Vegetables were stored carefully for the coming winter. These weeks were filled with activity. But when the work was finished, a quiet sense of relief spread through the village. Food had been gathered. Winter could now be faced with greater confidence. Winter brought a slower world. Cold winds moved across the open countryside. Frost appeared on the fields in the early morning. Sometimes snow fell across the valleys. During these months, families spent more time indoors. Clothing was repaired, tools were sharpened, food was carefully rationed to last until spring. Evenings were often spent beside the fire. Stories were told, songs were sometimes shared, and outside, the countryside rested in silence. Religion also shaped village life. The small church at the center of the village was an important place. Its walls were often built from rough stone. Inside, candles provided the main light. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wax. Villagers gathered there for prayer, for baptisms and marriages, for moments of celebration and mourning. The quiet ringing of the church bell marked important times during the day: morning prayers, midday rest, evening gatherings. Not far from some villages, monasteries stood in peaceful isolation. These were communities where monks lived lives of prayer and study. Their days followed a steady rhythm: morning prayers, work in gardens and fields, hours spent reading and writing, and quiet reflection at the end of the day. Travelers sometimes visited these monasteries. Pilgrims found shelter there. Messengers stopped to rest before continuing their journeys. The monasteries became small centers of stability in a changing world. Despite occasional visitors, most villagers rarely traveled far from their homes. Their lives were closely tied to the land around them. The same fields were planted year after year. The same paths were walked each day. Neighbors knew one another well. Families remained in the same communities for generations. For these people, the wider political changes of Gaul often felt distant. Kings might rise or fall, borders might shift, but the rhythm of daily life remained steady. Yet beyond the peaceful villages, important changes were taking place. In the northern regions of Gaul, and the Franks were becoming increasingly powerful. Their leaders gathered followers. Their influence spread across the land, and among those leaders, one young king would soon become the most important of them all. His name was Clovis, and his rise would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Gaul. Beyond the quiet villages and fields of Gaul, a new power was slowly rising. The Roman Empire had once ruled this land from distant cities, but as imperial authority faded, local leaders began to shape the future of the region. Among the peoples living in northern Gaul, one group was becoming especially influential. They were known as the Franks. The Franks had lived for generations along the northern frontiers of the Roman world. Sometimes they fought against Roman armies. Sometimes they served as soldiers within those same armies. Over time, many Frankish families settled inside the lands of Gaul. They farmed the soil. They traded with nearby towns, and their leaders gradually gained authority over surrounding territories. Among these leaders, one young king would eventually rise above the others. At the time, no one could yet know how important his decisions would become. His name was Clovis. When Clovis first became king, he ruled only a small territory. The Frankish world at that time was divided among many different rulers. Each leader controlled his own lands. Each commanded his own warriors. Power was scattered across the region. Clovis understood that if the Franks remained divided, their strength would remain limited. So he began slowly expanding his influence. At first, his authority grew through alliances. Some leaders chose to join him willingly, others resisted. When conflict came, Clovis proved to be a determined and capable warrior. Battles were fought across the plains and forests of northern Gaul. Warriors gathered beneath their banners, and slowly, year by year, Clovis increased his power. Yet even during these struggles, most people in Gaul continued their ordinary lives. Farmers worked the fields. Villages followed the rhythm of the seasons. Merchants traveled along the old Roman roads. For many villagers, the rise of kings and the fall of kingdoms seemed distant from their daily routines. But the decisions made by rulers like Clovis would eventually shape the future of the land. One moment from Clovis's life became famous in later centuries. According to tradition, it happened during a difficult battle. Clovis and his warriors were facing a powerful enemy. The fighting was intense. Victory seemed uncertain. As the battle continued, Clovis is said to have looked toward the sky and made a promise. If victory were granted to him, he would accept the Christian faith. This promise carried great meaning. At that time, many Frankish rulers still followed older religious traditions, but Christianity had already spread widely among the people of Gaul. According to the story, Clovis and his army soon gained the advantage. The battle turned in his favor, and the enemy forces were defeated. After this victory, Clovis remembered the promise he had made. Not long afterward, and he traveled to the city of Reims. There, inside a cathedral, a quiet ceremony took place. The cathedral was cool and dim. Candles flickered along the stone walls. A bishop stood beside the Frankish king. Clovis stepped forward. Water was poured gently over his head, and in that moment, he was baptized into the Christian faith. The ceremony was simple, but its meaning was enormous. By accepting Christianity, Clovis strengthened his connection with the people of Gaul. Most of the population already followed the Christian faith. Church leaders welcomed the new king, and the king offered protection to the church. This alliance between royal power and Christian belief would shape the history of France for centuries. After his conversion, Clovis continued expanding his kingdom. More territories came under his authority. Cities that once answered to Roman governors now recognized Frankish rule. Trade continued along the roads. Churches and monasteries slowly increased in number, and across the countryside, life remained steady. Farmers planted crops. Villages gathered for prayer. Travelers moved quietly across the land. When Clovis died, he left behind a kingdom far larger than the one he had inherited. Much of Gaul now stood under Frankish rule. The foundations of a new political order had been created. Over the centuries that followed, this Frankish kingdom would gradually evolve. From a collection of territories ruled by warrior kings into the early foundations of medieval France. And beyond the reign of Clovis, another powerful dynasty would soon rise, one that would expand the kingdom even further. A dynasty whose most famous ruler would be remembered across all of Europe. His name was Charlemagne. After the time of Clovis, the Frankish kingdom continued to evolve. His sons inherited the lands he had united. And like many royal families of the early medieval world, they divided the kingdom among themselves. Territories shifted from one ruler to another. Alliances formed and dissolved. Yet, through these changes, the Frankish presence across Gaul continued to grow stronger. Over time, a new family gradually rose to prominence within the Frankish realm. They would become known as the Carolingians. At first, members of this family did not rule as kings. Instead, they served as powerful advisors to the royal court. They organized armies. They managed the administration of large territories. And slowly, their influence expanded. One of the most important figures in this rising family was a ruler named Charles Martel. His leadership strengthened Frankish power during a time of uncertainty. Under his guidance, the kingdom became more stable, and the authority of the Carolingian family grew. Charles Martel's descendants would carry this influence even further. His son, Pepin, eventually became king of the Franks. And Pepin's own son would grow into one of the most famous rulers of the early medieval world. His name was Charlemagne. Charlemagne was born in the 8th century, during a time when the Frankish kingdom was becoming increasingly powerful. From a young age, he was surrounded by the responsibilities of leadership. He observed how territories were governed, how alliances were formed, and how authority could be maintained across wide regions of land. When Charlemagne eventually became king, he inherited a realm that already stretched across large portions of Western Europe. But his ambitions extended even further. During his reign, the Frankish kingdom expanded dramatically. Armies traveled across mountains and rivers. New territories came under Frankish rule. Regions that had once been independent now recognized Charlemagne as their king. Over time, his realm became the largest political power in Western Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. Yet, even as Charlemagne's empire grew, life for most people remained familiar. Across the countryside, villages continued their daily routines. Farmers planted crops. Shepherds guided animals across open fields. Markets gathered in towns along the old Roman roads. For many villagers, the decisions of kings were distant events. Their lives were shaped more by the seasons than by politics. Charlemagne understood that ruling such a large realm required more than military strength. He also encouraged learning and organization throughout his kingdom. Schools were supported within monasteries and churches. Scholars were invited to gather at his court, and efforts were made to preserve important texts from earlier centuries. This period would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because learning slowly began to flourish again. Within monasteries, monks continued the patient work of copying books. Ancient texts were carefully preserved. Religious writings were studied and shared. Libraries slowly grew, and knowledge from earlier centuries was passed quietly into the medieval world. All of this work happened far from the noise of battlefields. It happened in quiet rooms lit by candlelight, guided by careful hands and patient minds. Charlemagne also worked to organize the administration of his empire. Royal officials traveled between distant regions. They reported back to the king about local conditions. New laws were introduced to maintain order, and efforts were made to strengthen communication between the many territories of the realm. Travel across the empire remained slow. Roads wound across forests and rivers. Journeys often took many days. Yet these connections allowed Charlemagne to maintain authority across an enormous area. One winter day in the year 800, an important ceremony took place in the city of Rome. Charlemagne entered the great church of St. Peter. Candles illuminated the vast interior. Voices echoed softly across the stone walls. During the ceremony, the Pope placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head. With that act, Charlemagne was declared emperor. For many people, this moment symbolized the revival of imperial power in Western Europe. Not the old Roman Empire exactly, but something inspired by its memory. A new empire shaped by medieval traditions. Charlemagne ruled for many years. His authority extended across vast territories. Yet even within this large empire, the everyday world of villages and fields continued quietly. Farmers planted their crops. Church bells marked the passing hours. Travelers followed ancient roads through forests and valleys. The great events of kings unfolded slowly above the lives of ordinary people. After Charlemagne's death, his empire would eventually divide among his heirs. Borders would shift again. New kingdoms would appear across Europe, but the foundations laid during his reign would endure. The Frankish world had grown into a powerful medieval realm, and within that realm, the early foundations of France were continuing to take shape. After the time of Charlemagne, the vast empire he had created slowly changed. His descendants inherited different regions of the empire. Territories were divided among several rulers. Borders shifted as new kingdoms formed across Europe. The unity that Charlemagne had maintained gradually weakened. Yet, from this changing political landscape, a new system of organization began to emerge. It was a system that would shape medieval society for centuries. This system is often called feudalism. Feudal society was built upon relationships of loyalty and protection. Powerful lords controlled large territories of land. In return for loyalty and military service, they granted portions of that land to smaller nobles. These nobles became known as vassals. Each vassal promised to serve the lord above him, and in turn, he protected the people living on his land. This network of loyalty created a layered structure of authority across medieval Europe. At the center of many of these territories stood a castle. Early castles were not always the great stone fortresses people imagine today. Many of the first castles were built from earth and wood. A mound of earth called a motte rose above the surrounding land. On top of the mound stood a wooden tower. Below the mound, an enclosed courtyard known as the bailey contained houses, workshops, and storage buildings. A wooden wall surrounded the entire settlement. These early castles could be built relatively quickly, and they offered an important advantage: height. From the top of the tower, guards could watch the surrounding countryside for many miles. Over time, many of these wooden structures were replaced by stone. Stone walls were stronger. Stone towers could last for generations. Gradually, the familiar image of the medieval castle began to appear across the landscape. Tall towers rose above hilltops. Thick defensive walls surrounded inner courtyards. Narrow windows looked out across fields and forests. From a distance, these castles became visible landmarks across the countryside. Life inside a castle followed its own daily rhythm. The lord of the castle governed the surrounding lands. He settled disputes among villagers. He organized the defense of the territory. and he collected taxes or rents from the farmers who lived on the land. Knights often lived within the castle walls. These warriors served the lord in exchange for land and protection. They trained with swords and lances. They practiced riding horses. And when conflict arose, they were expected to fight for their lord. But castles were not only places of war, they were also homes. Inside the castle walls, families lived their daily lives. Meals were shared in large halls. Servants carried water and prepared food. Craftsmen repaired tools and weapons. Children learned the customs and traditions of noble society. Evenings were often spent beside large fireplaces. Stories were told. Music was sometimes played, and the sounds of the outside world faded beyond the castle walls. Outside the castle, the surrounding countryside continued its quiet routines. Villages stood within the territory controlled by the lord. Farmers worked the fields. Shepherds guided animals across the hills. Markets sometimes gathered near castle gates, where merchants sold cloth, tools, and food. The castle served as a center of authority, but the land around it remained shaped by agriculture and village life. For the people living in these villages, the lord of the castle offered protection. If danger threatened the countryside, villagers could seek refuge behind the castle walls. Enemies found it difficult to attack strong stone defenses, and the presence of the castle discouraged many conflicts before they even began. In this way, the castle became both a symbol of power and a place of safety. Across the lands that had once formed the empire of Charlemagne, castles gradually appeared in greater numbers: hilltops, river crossings, important roads. Each location was chosen carefully. From these positions, lords could watch over their territories and protect nearby communities. Over the centuries, and this landscape of castles and villages would define medieval Europe. Yet, even within this world of lords and fortresses, life still moved according to familiar patterns. Fields were planted in the spring. Harvests were gathered in autumn. Church bells marked the passing hours. Travelers moved along ancient roads between towns, and the quiet countryside remained the heart of daily life. From the villages of Gaul to the halls of castles to the courts of kings, the medieval world continued to grow and change. And in the centuries ahead, new forces would begin shaping the kingdom that was slowly becoming France. As castles spread across the medieval landscape, another figure became closely associated with this new world: the knight. Knights were warriors who served the lords who controlled the land. They fought on horseback. They carried swords, shields, and long lances, and they formed an important part of the military strength of medieval kingdoms. But the life of a knight was not only about battle. It was also shaped by training, loyalty, and tradition. Many knights began their training at a young age. Boys born into noble families were often sent to live in another lord's household. There, they learned the customs of noble society. They observed the behavior of experienced warriors, and they slowly prepared themselves for the responsibilities of knighthood. The first stage of this training began in childhood. A young boy might serve as a page. He carried messages. He assisted the ladies and nobles of the castle, and he began learning the manners and discipline expected in noble life. As the boy grew older, his training became more serious. He became a squire. Now he served directly under a knight. The squire cared for the knight's armor and weapons. He helped prepare the horse before travel or battle, and he practiced the skills needed for combat, sword training, riding, handling a lance. All of these abilities required patience and constant practice. Eventually, after many years of preparation, a squire might become a knight himself. The ceremony that marked this moment was often simple but meaningful. The young warrior knelt before his lord. An oath of loyalty was spoken, and the lord touched the squire's shoulder with the flat of a sword. With this gesture, the new knight rose to begin his life as a warrior. Armor became an important symbol of knighthood. Early medieval armor was often made from chainmail. Thousands of small metal rings were linked together to form a protective coat. This armor covered the chest, arms, and legs. A helmet protected the head, and a shield helped guard against enemy strikes. Although the armor was heavy, a trained knight could still move with surprising speed. Horses were equally important. A knight's horse was not an ordinary farm animal. These horses were strong and carefully trained. They carried their riders across battlefields. They moved quickly during charges, and they often wore protective coverings during combat. The relationship between knight and horse was essential. Both depended on one another during dangerous moments. Yet, despite the image of constant warfare, most knights spent much of their lives away from battle. In times of peace, they lived within castles or nearby estates. They managed land, they supervised workers, and they helped maintain order within the territories controlled by their lord. Daily life involved many responsibilities beyond fighting. Training continued even during peaceful years. Knights practiced with weapons. They rode horses across open fields. They participated in tournaments, events where warriors demonstrated their skills in controlled competitions. These gatherings were both practice and entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch. Banners moved in the wind, and the sound of hooves echoed across the fields. The ideals of knighthood were also shaped by ideas of honor and loyalty. Knights were expected to serve their lord faithfully. They were expected to protect the weak, and they were encouraged to show courage in difficult situations. Stories and songs of the medieval world often celebrated these values. Poets wrote about heroic knights. Musicians sang of loyalty and bravery. These stories helped shape how knights saw themselves and their role in society. Religion also influenced the world of knighthood. Many knights believed they were defending not only their lands, but also their faith. Before important journeys or battles, prayers were often offered in nearby churches. Monks and priests sometimes traveled with armies, and religious symbols were often carried into battle. For villagers living near castles, knights were both protectors and powerful figures. They defended the land during times of conflict, but they also represented the authority of the lord. When knights rode through the countryside, their presence reminded people of the structure of medieval society. Lords ruled the land. Knights served the lords, and villagers worked the fields that supported the entire system. Across the lands that were gradually becoming the Kingdom of France, this world of castles, knights, and villages became the foundation of society. The rhythms of medieval life continued. Fields were planted. Church bells rang across the valleys. Travelers moved along ancient roads, and above the quiet countryside, castle towers watched over the land. Yet the story of medieval France was far from finished. New kings would rise, cities would grow, and great cathedrals would soon appear across the land. The centuries ahead would bring change, but always at the slow and steady pace of history. As the centuries passed, the lands that had once belonged to the Frankish rulers continued to change. After the death of Charlemagne, his vast empire slowly divided. Different regions came under different kings. Borders shifted across the map of Western Europe. Out of these changes, a new political landscape gradually appeared, and within that landscape, a kingdom known as France slowly began to take shape. During the early medieval centuries, power was often spread across many local lords. Castles stood across the countryside. Knights served their regional rulers. and kings sometimes controlled only a small portion of the land that officially belonged to them. Yet over time, a new royal dynasty would begin strengthening the authority of the French crown. This dynasty became known as the Capetians. The Capetian story began with a king named Hugh Capet. In the year 987, Hugh Capet was chosen as king by a group of powerful nobles. His coronation took place in the city of Reims, the same city where Clovis had been baptized centuries earlier. At the time, Hugh Capet did not rule a large or powerful kingdom. Much of the land that would later become France was controlled by independent lords. Dukes governed large territories, counts controlled important cities, and many castles stood far beyond the direct authority of the king. Yet Hugh Capet's reign marked the beginning of a new royal line. Unlike earlier rulers whose kingdoms often divided among their heirs, the Capetian kings gradually established a more stable succession. The crown passed from father to son, and over generations, this continuity strengthened the idea of a lasting monarchy. At first, the Capetian kings ruled only a small region around the city of Paris. This area became known as the royal domain. Within these lands, the king exercised direct authority. Royal officials helped govern towns and villages. Taxes were collected, and the king's influence was clearly visible. Beyond this royal domain, however, many powerful lords continued to rule their own territories with considerable independence. Life in medieval France during these centuries still followed familiar patterns. Villages worked their fields. Markets gathered in towns. Castles guarded river crossings and important roads. The king remained an important figure, but the daily lives of most people were shaped by local communities. Still, the Capetian kings slowly increased their influence. They formed alliances through marriage. They negotiated with powerful nobles, and they carefully expanded the lands under royal control. Paris gradually became an important center of royal authority. Situated along the river Seine, the city provided access to trade routes that connected many regions of the kingdom. Merchants traveled along the river carrying goods between towns. Markets grew busier, and the presence of the royal court brought additional attention to the city. Over time, Paris began to develop into one of the most important cities in medieval France. Religion continued to play a central role in the kingdom. Churches and monasteries stood across the countryside. Bishops advised kings. Monks preserved learning within monastery libraries, and cathedrals rose slowly above medieval towns. These great stone buildings required years to complete. Sometimes generations of workers contributed to their construction, yet, when finished, their towers could be seen from miles away. They became symbols of faith and community across the land. The Capetian kings also worked to strengthen the legal authority of the crown. Royal courts gradually expanded their influence. Disputes between nobles were sometimes brought before the king. Laws developed slowly as traditions and royal decisions combined. This process was gradual, but over time, it helped increase the power of the monarchy. For the people living in medieval France, the centuries of Capetian rule brought slow but steady change. Cities grew larger, trade expanded, learning developed in cathedral schools and monasteries, and the idea of a unified kingdom became stronger. The king was no longer simply one lord among many. He was increasingly seen as the ruler of an entire realm. Yet the medieval world still moved at its patient pace. Farmers continued planting crops each spring. Harvests filled village barns in autumn. Church bells echoed across the countryside, and travelers followed the same ancient roads that had once carried Roman soldiers centuries earlier. Within this quiet rhythm of daily life, the Kingdom of France was slowly becoming more unified. New kings inherited the Capetian crown, royal authority spread gradually across the land. And the story of France continued to unfold, century by century, in the steady passage of time. As the Capuchin kings slowly strengthened their authority, another transformation was quietly taking place across medieval France. Cities began to grow. For many centuries after the fall of Rome, much of life had been centered in villages and rural communities. But by the High Middle Ages, towns and cities were slowly returning to prominence. Markets became more active. Trade routes grew busier, and urban life gradually expanded across the kingdom. Many medieval towns developed near rivers. Waterways offered an easier way to transport goods than long journeys over land. Boats carried grain, wine, timber, and cloth between different regions. Merchants followed these routes, connecting distant towns through networks of trade. Along the banks of these rivers, small settlements slowly grew into larger communities. Markets were the heart of urban life. On certain days of the week, people from nearby villages traveled into town. Farmers brought vegetables, grain, cheese, and meat. Craftsmen displayed tools, pottery, and cloth. Merchants arrived with goods from distant regions. The marketplace filled with voices and movement. Wooden stalls stood beside narrow streets. Baskets of produce lined the ground, and the smell of bread baking drifted through the air. These markets were not only places of trade, they were also places of news. Travelers shared stories from other towns. Merchants spoke of distant lands. Messengers carried information about kings, wars, and political changes. In a world without newspapers or printed books, news traveled by word of mouth. The marketplace became one of the most important places where people learned about events beyond their villages. Craft production also grew within medieval towns. Many workers specialized in particular skills. Blacksmiths shaped iron tools and horseshoes. Carpenters built furniture and repaired houses. Weavers produced cloth from wool or linen. Potters shaped vessels used in kitchens and markets. Over time, craftsmen formed associations known as guilds. These organizations helped regulate trade. They set standards for quality. They trained apprentices who wished to learn the craft, and they supported members of their profession. Guilds became an important part of medieval urban life. Streets within medieval towns were often narrow and winding. Houses stood close together. Many buildings were constructed from timber. Upper floors sometimes extended outward over the street below. This design allowed families to expand their living space while keeping the ground level open for shops or workshops. During busy market days, the streets filled with people moving between stalls and stores. Religion remained central within the growing towns. Large churches and cathedrals rose above the surrounding buildings. These structures often took decades to complete. Stone masons carved intricate designs into walls and towers. Glass artisans created colorful stained glass windows. Inside, the light passing through these windows filled the interior with soft colors. People gathered there for prayer, for ceremonies, and for moments of reflection. The cathedral became both a religious center and a symbol of civic pride. Education also began developing within some of these urban centers. Schools connected to cathedrals trained young scholars. Students studied religious texts, philosophy, and law. Over time, some of these schools evolved into early universities. Paris would eventually become one of the most famous centers of learning in medieval Europe. Scholars from distant lands traveled there to study and teach. Despite this growth, medieval cities were still modest in size compared with modern ones. Most towns contained only a few thousand inhabitants. Stone walls often surrounded the urban area. These defensive walls protected the population during times of danger. Large gates controlled who entered or left the city. At night, these gates were often closed. Life inside the town followed its own rhythm. Morning brought the opening of shops and workshops. Merchants arranged goods for display. Craftsmen began their work. The sound of hammers, voices, and carts filled the streets. By midday, the market was often at its busiest, and by evening, the activity gradually slowed. Candles lit the windows of homes and taverns. The city settled into quiet. Beyond the town walls, the countryside still surrounded these growing urban centers. Farmers continued to cultivate the land. Villages continued their familiar routines. Food from these rural areas supported the growing population of the towns. In this way, city and countryside remained closely connected. Each depended upon the other. Across medieval France, this gradual growth of cities and trade helped strengthen the kingdom. Commerce connected distant regions. Ideas traveled more easily between communities, and royal authority benefited from the increasing wealth generated by trade. Yet, even as towns expanded, life continued to move at the slow pace of the medieval world. Church bells marked the passing hours. Markets gathered and dispersed. Travelers followed winding roads between cities. And across the kingdom, the long story of France continued to unfold. As towns and cities grew across medieval France, another presence rose above the rooftops: the cathedral. These great stone buildings became the spiritual centers of medieval communities. Their towers could often be seen from far beyond the city walls. Travelers approaching a town would sometimes first notice the tall spires rising above the surrounding landscape. For many people of the medieval world, the cathedral was the most impressive structure they had ever seen. Religion shaped nearly every part of life during these centuries. The church guided spiritual belief. It also influenced education, law, and community life. Bishops advised kings. Priests served villages and towns, and monasteries preserved learning across the countryside. The cathedral stood at the center of this religious world. Building a cathedral was an enormous task. Construction often lasted for many decades. Sometimes it continued for more than a century. Stone blocks had to be quarried and transported. Wooden scaffolding rose high above the streets. Craftsmen worked patiently on every part of the structure. Masons shaped stone walls. Carpenters built supports and frameworks. Glassmakers created colorful windows. Each worker contributed to a project far larger than any single lifetime. The style of architecture that appeared during these centuries is now known as Gothic. Tall, pointed arches supported the structure. Stone ribs strengthened the ceilings. Large, stained glass windows filled the interior with colored light. When sunlight passed through the glass, reds, blues, and golds illuminated the stone walls. To the people who entered these buildings, the effect could feel almost magical. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was calm and solemn. Candles flickered in the dim interior. The scent of incense drifted slowly through the air. Voices echoed softly during prayer and song. Large wooden doors opened into wide stone halls. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above the floor. For many medieval people, entering a cathedral was a moment of awe. Cathedrals were not only places for worship, they were also important centers of community life. Important announcements were made there. Royal ceremonies sometimes took place inside their walls. Festivals and religious holidays gathered large crowds in the surrounding squares. During these moments, the cathedral became the heart of the city. Schools often developed near cathedrals. Young students gathered to study reading, writing, and religious texts. Teachers explained philosophy and theology. Over time, these cathedral schools became important centers of learning. Some eventually developed into early universities. Paris became one of the most famous of these intellectual centers. Students traveled from many lands to study there. The church also provided care for people in need. Hospitals and charitable institutions were often connected to religious communities. Monks and nuns helped the poor and the sick. Food was sometimes distributed to those who lacked resources. In a world where social support systems were limited, these acts of charity played an important role in community life. Across the countryside, smaller churches stood in villages and rural towns. Their buildings were simpler than the great cathedrals of the cities, yet their role was just as meaningful to the people who lived nearby. The church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. Morning prayer, midday rest, evening gatherings. These sounds carried across the fields and valleys. They reminded villagers of the spiritual world that surrounded their everyday work. Pilgrimage was another important part of medieval religious life. Many believers traveled long distances to visit holy sites. Some journeys lasted weeks or months. Pilgrims followed established routes across Europe. Along these roads, monasteries and churches provided shelter and food. Travelers shared stories from distant regions, and the movement of pilgrims helped connect communities across the continent. Despite the spiritual importance of the church, medieval life still remained closely tied to the land. Farmers planted crops in spring. Harvests filled barns in autumn. Markets gathered in town squares. Travelers walked the same roads that had once carried Roman armies centuries earlier. Yet above these familiar routines, the towers of cathedrals continued to rise. Stone by stone, generation after generation, they shaped the skyline of medieval France. These buildings became symbols of both faith and community. They reminded people that their towns were part of something larger, a kingdom, a church, a shared culture that stretched across the lands of Europe. And as the centuries continued, new challenges and conflicts would soon test that medieval world. Among them, one long and difficult struggle between France and England. A conflict that would shape the destiny of the kingdom for generations. It would later be remembered as the 100 Years' War. By the early 14th century, the Kingdom of France had grown stronger than it had been in earlier centuries. Cities were expanding. Trade connected distant regions. Cathedrals and castles rose above towns and countryside. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, a new conflict was slowly developing. It would eventually become one of the longest wars in European history. The struggle between the kingdoms of France and England. The roots of this conflict stretched back many generations. For centuries, the kings of England had controlled territories within France. These lands had been inherited through earlier marriages and political agreements. As a result, the English king was both a powerful ruler in his own country and also a vassal who held lands within the French kingdom. In this unusual situation created tension between the two monarchies. Questions of loyalty and authority were never completely settled. In the year 1328, the French royal line faced a moment of uncertainty. King Charles IV of France died without a male heir. The question of who should inherit the throne quickly became the subject of intense debate. Several candidates had claims to the crown. Among them was Edward III, the King of England. Edward was the grandson of a previous French king through his mother. He believed this connection gave him a rightful claim to the French throne. French nobles viewed the matter differently. They chose another candidate, Philip of Valois. Philip became King Philip VI of France. His coronation marked the beginning of the Valois dynasty. Edward III initially accepted Philip's authority, but the relationship between the two kings remained uneasy. Disputes over land and political influence continued to grow. Over the following years, tensions slowly increased. Trade disagreements created economic pressure. Conflicts over territory intensified, and both sides began preparing for the possibility of war. Finally, in 1337, Edward III formally claimed the French crown for himself. With that declaration, the long struggle between France and England began. This conflict would later be known as the 100 Years' War. Despite its name, the war was not a single continuous battle. Instead, it unfolded over many decades. Periods of intense fighting were followed by years of uneasy peace. Generations grew up while the conflict continued around them. For ordinary people, the war often appeared as a distant and unpredictable force. Sometimes it passed quietly. At other times, it arrived suddenly and violently. Early battles in the war brought surprising victories for the English armies. Their forces included large numbers of skilled archers. These archers used the longbow, a powerful weapon capable of striking enemies from great distances. In several early encounters, English forces defeated larger French armies. These victories shocked many observers across Europe. The outcome of the conflict seemed uncertain. The war also brought hardship to the countryside. Armies traveling through rural regions often consumed large amounts of food. Villages were sometimes caught between opposing forces. Farmers struggled to protect their crops and animals. Trade routes became less secure. In some areas, the steady rhythms of village life were disrupted by the presence of soldiers and conflict. Cities and castles became important defensive centers during these years. Stone walls offered protection against attacks. Towns prepared supplies in case of siege. Watchmen guarded city gates. Messengers carried news between regions. Despite the dangers, daily life continued wherever possible. Markets still gathered. Church bells still rang. Families still worked their fields and homes. The conflict between France and England would continue through many generations. Kings would rise and fall. Armies would march across fields and valleys. Fortunes would shift many times during the struggle. Yet, within this long and difficult war, one young woman would eventually appear, whose story would become legendary. A figure remembered for courage and faith. Her name was Joan of Arc, but her story would begin many years after the war had already begun. And for the people living through the early decades of conflict, the future of France remained uncertain. During the long years of the 100 Years' War, France faced many difficult moments. Territories changed hands. Armies moved across the countryside. Cities sometimes fell under the control of foreign forces. For the people living through these uncertain times, the future often seemed unclear. Yet, in the middle of this troubled era, a remarkable story would begin in a small village. The village was called Domremy. It was a quiet place, the kind of village where history rarely seemed to arrive. It stood in the eastern regions of France, near fields, forests, and quiet rivers. Domremy was not a large place. Only a few dozen homes stood along its narrow paths. Farm animals grazed in nearby meadows. Farmers worked the land much as their ancestors had done for generations. Life there followed the familiar rhythm of the seasons. It was in this village, around the year 1412, that a girl named Joan was born. Her family were farmers. They owned a small amount of land. Like most people in the village, they lived a modest life centered on work and faith. Joan grew up helping with daily tasks. She watched animals. She worked in the fields. She helped care for the household. From an early age, she was known for her deep sense of religious devotion. The church played an important role in Joan's life. Like other villagers, she attended services regularly. She listened to the teachings of priests, and she spent time in quiet prayer. Religion offered comfort during uncertain times. The war between France and England had lasted for many years. News of battles and shifting borders occasionally reached even small villages like Domremy. Yet the daily routines of farming and family life continued. When Joan was still a young girl, she began to experience something she would later describe in remarkable terms. According to her own accounts, she began hearing voices. These voices were not ordinary sounds. She believed they were messages from heavenly figures, saints and angels, guiding her toward a special purpose. At first, these experiences confused her, but over time, she came to believe that she had been chosen to help France during its darkest moment. Meanwhile, the political situation in France had become increasingly difficult. English forces controlled large areas of the country. Important cities had fallen, and the French royal heir, known as the Dauphin Charles, struggled to maintain authority. Many people doubted whether France could recover from these setbacks. It was during this troubled period that Joan became convinced she must act. As she grew older, Joan began speaking about the mission she believed she had been given. She said that she must travel to meet the Dauphin. She believed she was meant to help drive the English forces from France. At first, the people around her found these claims difficult to believe. Joan was young. She had no military training. She came from a small farming village far from the royal court, yet she remained determined. Eventually, with the help of supporters who believed in her sincerity, Joan was able to travel toward the French royal court. Her journey was not easy. The roads were dangerous. The country remained divided by war. But step by step, she moved closer to the place where her story would truly begin. When Joan finally reached the city where the Dauphin was staying, she requested an audience with him. Many advisors at court were skeptical. They questioned whether this young village girl could truly offer any help in the struggle against England. But curiosity grew, and eventually, Joan was allowed to meet the future king. That meeting would become one of the most famous moments in medieval history. The young woman from Domremy stood before the royal court. She spoke with confidence about her mission. She declared that France could still be saved. Her faith and determination made a powerful impression. In the difficult years of the 100 Years' War, many people had begun to lose hope. Yet, Joan's conviction offered something different, a sense that change might still be possible. Soon, events would begin to move quickly. Armies would gather. A great siege would be lifted, and the name of Joan of Arc would spread across France. But at the beginning of her story, she was simply a young woman from a quiet village, a daughter of farmers, someone who believed deeply in the message she felt called to deliver. And in the years ahead, her courage would help change the course of the war. After Joan of Arc met the Dauphin Charles, events began to move more quickly. For many years, the French kingdom had struggled to defend itself. English armies controlled large parts of the country. Important cities had fallen. Confidence among the French nobles was often uncertain. Yet Joan spoke with remarkable conviction. She insisted that France could still be saved. After careful questioning by church officials and advisors, the Dauphin eventually allowed Joan to accompany a French army. She was given armor, a horse, and a small group of soldiers to travel with her. Although she had never fought in battle, her presence inspired many who met her. People were struck by her determination and her faith. Word spread quickly across the land. A young woman had come forward claiming she could help change the course of the war. At that time, one city held particular importance, the city of Orléans. Orléans stood along the Loire River. It controlled an important crossing point. If the English captured the city, they could push deeper into southern France. The siege of Orléans had already lasted many months. Inside the walls, people waited, and they wondered how much longer the city could endure. English forces had surrounded the city with fortified positions. Inside the walls, the people of Orléans waited anxiously. Supplies were limited. Hope was fading. Many feared that the city might eventually fall. In the spring of 1429, Joan and a French army approached the region. Their goal was clear. They would attempt to break the siege and relieve the city. The journey toward Orléans drew attention from many people. Some were curious, others were skeptical, but the soldiers traveling with Joan began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. Her confidence gave them courage. When Joan entered Orléans, the people of the city greeted her with excitement. For months, they had lived under the threat of siege. Now, a new symbol of hope had arrived. Joan encouraged the defenders to remain strong. She spoke to the soldiers and citizens with calm determination. Although she did not command the army alone, her influence quickly became clear. Over the following days, the French forces launched several attacks against the English positions surrounding the city. Fortified towers and defensive structures stood along the riverbanks and roads. These positions had helped maintain the siege. Now, they became the focus of the fighting. The battles were difficult. Soldiers moved cautiously across the fields. Arrows and cannon fire filled the air. Yet the French army continued pressing forward. Joan often remained close to the front lines. She carried a banner rather than a weapon. Her presence encouraged the soldiers advancing beside her. During one of the assaults, she was wounded by an arrow. For a moment, the attack slowed. But after receiving treatment, Joan returned to the battlefield. Her return strengthened the determination of the French troops. Gradually, the English positions around the city began to fall. One stronghold after another was captured. The defenders of Orléans gained new confidence. The long siege that had lasted for months was finally weakening. And soon, the English forces withdrew from the area. The siege of Orléans had been lifted. News of the victory spread quickly throughout France. For the first time in many years, the French had achieved a major success against the English armies. People across the kingdom heard the story of the young woman who had helped inspire the army. Joan of Arc's name became widely known. To many, she represented hope during a difficult time. The victory at Orléans changed the direction of the war. French forces began gaining momentum. Additional towns and territories soon returned to French control. The Dauphin, Charles, now had an opportunity to strengthen his claim to the throne. And Joan believed that the next step in her mission was clear. The Dauphin must travel to the city of Reims. There, in the traditional cathedral of French coronations, he would be crowned king. The journey toward Reims would not be easy. Enemy forces still controlled parts of the country. But the victory at Orléans had changed the mood of the kingdom. Confidence slowly returned, and the story of Joan of Arc was only beginning. In the months ahead, her courage would lead to one of the most important ceremonies in the history of France, the coronation of King Charles VII. After the victory at Orléans, a new sense of hope spread across the kingdom of France. For many years, the war against England had brought uncertainty and loss. Cities had fallen. Territories had changed hands. Confidence in the future of the French crown had weakened. Yet, the lifting of the siege of Orléans suggested that the course of the war might be changing. Among those who believed this most strongly was Joan of Arc. She was convinced that the Dauphin Charles must travel to the city of Reims. There, according to long tradition, the kings of France were crowned. Only through this ceremony, she believed, could Charles truly become the rightful king. The journey to Reims was not simple. The city stood deep within territory that had often been contested during the war. Enemy forces still controlled parts of the countryside. Many advisors at court were cautious. They feared that such a journey might place the Dauphin in danger. Yet Joan remained certain. She believed that the path would open if the army moved forward with determination. Eventually, Charles agreed. Preparations began for a long march across the country. The army gathered supplies. Messengers were sent to towns along the route. And slowly, the royal procession began its journey. As the army moved northward, something unexpected happened. Several towns along the route opened their gates without resistance. Local leaders recognized the growing strength of the French cause. They chose to support the Dauphin rather than oppose him. In town after town, the army was welcomed. Citizens gathered in the streets to watch the procession pass, and the path toward Reims became easier than many had feared. Throughout the journey, Joan rode beside the soldiers. Her banner moved in the wind as the army traveled along roads and across fields. People who saw her often felt a sense of inspiration. For them, she represented courage and faith during a difficult time. The story of the young woman from Domremy continued to spread from village to village. At last, the army reached the city of Reims. The great cathedral stood tall above the surrounding streets. Its stone towers rose high into the sky. For centuries, this cathedral had been the traditional place where French kings were crowned. Now, the moment had arrived once again. Inside the cathedral, preparations were made for the coronation ceremony. Candles illuminated the vast interior. Clergy gathered near the altar. Nobles and soldiers filled the surrounding space. The air carried a quiet sense of anticipation. On the day of the ceremony, Charles entered the cathedral. The rituals followed ancient traditions. Prayers were spoken. Sacred oil was used in the anointing of the king. And finally, the crown was placed upon his head. Charles was now crowned as King Charles VII of France. For many people present, this moment carried deep significance. It confirmed that the French monarchy still stood. The long traditions of the kingdom continued, and the authority of the new king was recognized. Joan of Arc stood nearby during the ceremony. Her mission, as she understood it, had been fulfilled. The king had been crowned. France had regained hope. After the coronation, celebrations filled the city. Bells rang from the towers of the cathedral. Crowds gathered in the streets. Music and voices echoed through the squares. For a brief moment, the long years of war seemed distant. Yet the conflict with England had not ended. Many regions of France remained under enemy control, and political tensions still divided parts of the kingdom. The road ahead would remain difficult, but the coronation of Charles VII marked an important turning point. It strengthened the legitimacy of the French crown, and it renewed confidence among those who supported the king. For Joan of Arc, the journey that had begun in a quiet village had reached a remarkable moment. From the fields of Domremy to the walls of Orléans to the Cathedral of Reims, her faith and determination had helped change the course of events. Yet her story was not finished. In the months that followed, new challenges would appear, and the fate of Joan herself would soon take a tragic turn. But the memory of the coronation at Reims would remain, a symbol of hope during one of the most difficult periods in the history of France. After the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, many people across France believed that the fortunes of the war had finally begun to change. The king had been crowned according to ancient tradition. The French cause had gained renewed confidence, and the name of Joan of Arc had become known throughout the kingdom. Yet the conflict with England was far from over. Large regions of France remained under English control. Powerful allies of England still held important cities, and the long war continued across the countryside. Joan believed that the next step should be to drive the English completely out of France. She encouraged the king and his advisors to continue the campaign. Some of the king's commanders supported her enthusiasm. Others were more cautious. They worried that further battles might bring unnecessary risks. For a time, military campaigns continued. Several towns were retaken. French forces gained ground in different parts of the country, but the momentum of the earlier victories began to slow. By the following year, the situation had become more complicated. Political negotiations were taking place. Alliances shifted between different regions, and the war entered another uncertain phase. During this time, Joan continued traveling with French forces as they defended key territories. Her determination had not faded. She still believed strongly that France could be completely freed. In the spring of 1430, Joan arrived near the town of Compiègne. This town lay north of Paris and remained loyal to the French king. Enemy forces threatened the region. Joan joined the defenders who were preparing to protect the town. The situation was tense. Armies moved cautiously across the countryside. Scouts watched for signs of approaching troops, and the people of the town prepared for the possibility of battle. One evening, Joan and a group of soldiers rode out from the town to confront enemy forces nearby. At first, the engagement followed the familiar pattern of medieval skirmishes. Soldiers advanced and withdrew across the fields. But the situation soon changed. Reinforcements arrived for the opposing side. The French forces found themselves outnumbered. Gradually, they began retreating toward the safety of the town walls. As the soldiers withdrew, the gates of Compiègne were prepared to close. This was necessary to prevent enemy troops from entering the city. During the confusion of the retreat, Joan was separated from many of her companions. Before she could reach the safety of the gate, enemy soldiers surrounded her. She was pulled from her horse and taken prisoner. The capture of Joan of Arc quickly became known across the region. For the French, the news was deeply troubling. She had become a powerful symbol of hope and determination. For the opposing forces, her capture represented a major opportunity. They understood that Joan's influence had helped inspire the French army. Holding her as a prisoner offered both political and symbolic advantages. Joan was transferred between several locations during her captivity. Eventually, she was handed over to English authorities and their allies. Plans were made to put her on trial, not as a military enemy, but on charges related to her claims of divine guidance. Church officials would examine her statements, her visions, and the actions she had taken during the war. Meanwhile, the war itself continued. Armies still moved across the countryside. Cities remained contested. The fate of the kingdom was still uncertain. Yet Joan's absence was deeply felt. The young woman who had helped lift the siege of Orléans and inspire the coronation of the king was now a prisoner. Her future depended on the outcome of a trial that would soon begin. For many people in France, the story of Joan of Arc had already become extraordinary. From a small farming village, she had risen to stand beside kings and armies. She had helped change the course of the war during one of its darkest moments. Now, in captivity, her fate would soon be decided, and the outcome of that decision would leave a lasting mark on the history of France. After her capture near the town of Compiègne, Joan of Arc was taken far from the battlefields where she had once inspired soldiers. She was transported north through regions controlled by the enemies of the French crown. Eventually, she arrived in the city of Rouen. At that time, Rouen was under the control of English forces and their allies. It was here that Joan would face a trial that would determine her fate. The purpose of the trial was not simply to judge her as a prisoner of war. Instead, the proceedings focused on her claims of divine guidance. During the years of conflict, Joan had spoken openly about the voices she believed had guided her actions. She said that saints and heavenly messengers had instructed her to help France. For her supporters, these claims strengthened her image as a figure of faith and courage. For her enemies, they raised questions that could be used against her. Church officials were appointed to conduct the trial. Scholars and clerics gathered in Rouen to question her. The proceedings were long and complex. Many sessions were held over several months. During these sessions, Joan was asked about her life, her visions, her journey to meet the Dauphin, and the role she had played in the war. Despite her young age, Joan answered many of the questions with calm determination. She spoke carefully about the voices she believed had guided her. She described her experiences in the village of Domremy. She explained the mission she believed she had been given. Those present often remarked on her composure. She faced a room filled with educated judges and scholars, yet she continued to respond with confidence. The trial was conducted according to the legal procedures of the time. Questions were carefully recorded. Witnesses were consulted. Documents were prepared by clerks who wrote down each exchange. Yet the circumstances surrounding the trial remained deeply influenced by the political situation of the war. Joan had become a powerful symbol for the French cause. Her enemies hoped that condemning her would weaken that symbol. As the questioning continued, the judges examined many aspects of her story. They asked about the voices she claimed to hear. They questioned her decision to wear military clothing. They debated whether her actions could be considered acceptable within the teachings of the Church. These discussions filled many long days inside the courtroom. Joan remained imprisoned during the trial. She was kept under guard inside the castle at Rouen. Her movements were restricted, and she had little contact with the outside world. Despite these conditions, she continued to defend her beliefs during the questioning. Her responses revealed both faith and resilience. Eventually, the judges reached their conclusion. They declared that Joan had committed serious religious offenses. She was found guilty of heresy. The sentence was severe. According to the ruling, she would face execution. In the spring of 1431, the final events of Joan's life took place in the city of Rouen. Crowds gathered in the marketplace where the sentence would be carried out. The atmosphere was solemn. Many people watched in silence. Some observers later wrote that they felt a deep sense of sadness at the scene. Joan remained calm in the final moments of her life. She asked for prayers. She spoke of her faith. And she faced her fate with the same determination that had marked her earlier actions. Her execution took place on May 30th, 1431. She was only 19 years old. News of her death spread across France and beyond. For her enemies, the trial had removed a powerful figure from the battlefield. But for many others, Joan's story continued to inspire reflection and admiration. Over time, her courage and conviction would be remembered in songs, chronicles, and histories. Years later, the Church itself would revisit the trial. New investigations would examine the events that had taken place in Rouen. Eventually, Joan would be declared innocent of the charges brought against her, and centuries later, she would be honored as a saint. Yet, during the years immediately following her death, the war between France and England continued. Armies still marched across the countryside. Cities remained contested, and the future of the French kingdom was still uncertain. But the memory of the young woman from Domremy remained powerful. Her story had already become part of the history of France, a story of faith, courage, and determination during one of the most difficult chapters of the kingdom's past. After the death of Joan of Arc in 1431, the war between France and England did not immediately end. Armies still moved across the countryside. Fortresses and cities remained contested, and the conflict that had already lasted for generations continued into new years of struggle. Yet, during the decades that followed, the balance of power slowly began to change. King Charles VII gradually strengthened his position. Although the early years of his reign had been uncertain, he now focused on rebuilding the authority of the French crown. Advisors helped reorganize the royal administration. Taxes were collected more consistently, and the king began forming a more stable military force. This marked an important shift. For much of the medieval period, armies had been raised temporarily during times of war. Now, Charles VII worked toward creating a more permanent royal army. This new organization allowed French forces to operate more effectively. Soldiers could be trained and supplied more regularly. Commanders developed better coordination between different regions of the kingdom. Gradually, French armies began reclaiming territories that had long been held by the English. Cities and castles that had once been under foreign control slowly returned to French authority. At the same time, conditions within England also changed. Political tensions developed among English leaders. Resources for maintaining distant campaigns became more limited. The long war across the English Channel required enormous expense. Maintaining armies in France for decades had strained the kingdom's finances. These pressures weakened England's ability to continue the conflict at the same intensity. During the 1440s and early 1450s, French forces gained increasing momentum. Improved artillery began playing a larger role in warfare. Cannons were used to break down the walls of fortified cities. This technology gradually changed the nature of medieval battles. Castles that had once seemed nearly impossible to conquer could now be threatened by sustained artillery fire. One by one, English strongholds in France began to fall. Important cities returned to French control. The territory held by England grew smaller with each passing year. Although fighting still occurred, the overall direction of the war had clearly shifted. The final major confrontation came in 1453. At the Battle of Castillon, French forces faced the remaining English army in southwestern France. The French army had prepared defensive positions supported by artillery. When the English troops advanced, they encountered a carefully organized defense. The battle ended in a decisive French victory. After this defeat, England's remaining position in France collapsed. Only a small coastal region near the city of Calais remained under English control. The long conflict that had begun more than a century earlier was effectively over. Historians would later refer to this entire struggle as the 100 Years' War, though in reality, it had lasted for about 116 years. For the people of France, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter. The kingdom had endured decades of conflict. Villages had been disrupted. Trade had been interrupted. Entire regions had experienced hardship and uncertainty. Yet, by the mid-15th century, France had emerged more unified than before. Royal authority was stronger. Territories once divided by competing claims were now largely reunited. King Charles VII continued working to strengthen the monarchy. Administrative reforms improved governance across the kingdom. A more permanent army helped maintain stability, and the authority of the crown extended more firmly into regions that had once acted independently. These changes helped lay the foundations for a stronger French state in the centuries that followed. Meanwhile, the memory of Joan of Arc remained powerful. Her story continued to circulate throughout the kingdom. Chroniclers wrote about her courage. Songs and tales repeated her achievements. For many people, she remained a symbol of faith and determination during the darkest years of the war. As peace slowly returned, life across the countryside began to recover. Farmers returned to their fields. Markets became more active once again. Cities repaired damage caused during the years of conflict. Church bells rang across towns and villages as they had for generations. And gradually, the kingdom entered a new era. the medieval world itself was also beginning to change. New ideas would soon spread across Europe. Exploration would expand knowledge of distant lands, and powerful monarchies would shape the future of entire nations. For France, the end of the 100 Years' War marked the closing of one long chapter in its history. A chapter filled with hardship, but also with resilience and transformation. After the long years of the 100 Years' War, France slowly entered a new period of recovery. For generations, conflict had shaped the lives of kings, soldiers, and villagers alike. Fields had been damaged, trade had been disrupted, and many towns had struggled to rebuild. Yet, by the middle of the 15th century, a gradual transformation began to take place. Peace allowed the kingdom to regain strength. King Charles VII continued strengthening the authority of the crown. Royal officials worked to improve the administration of the kingdom. Taxes were collected more consistently. The royal army remained active even during times of peace. This stability helped create conditions in which the country could slowly recover from the long conflict. Agriculture once again became the foundation of daily life. Farmers returned to fields that had been neglected during the war. Villages repaired homes and barns. Markets reopened along familiar trade routes. Gradually, food production increased. Rural communities regained a sense of normal rhythm. The countryside that had endured decades of conflict slowly returned to quiet productivity. Cities also began to flourish once more. Merchants resumed long-distance trade. Craftsmen reopened workshops. Markets grew busier as goods moved between towns and regions. New buildings appeared in expanding neighborhoods. Urban life gradually regained its energy. In many places, the sounds of construction replaced the echoes of war. During this time, new cultural influences also began to spread across Europe. Artists, scholars, and writers rediscovered many works from ancient Greece and Rome. They studied classical philosophy. They admired ancient architecture. And they explored new approaches to art and learning. This period became known as the Renaissance. The word itself means rebirth. It described a renewed interest in knowledge, creativity, and human achievement. Italy was one of the first regions where Renaissance ideas flourished. Cities such as Florence and Venice became centers of artistic and intellectual activity. But these ideas gradually traveled across the Alps into France. French scholars began studying classical texts. Artists experimented with new techniques in painting and sculpture. Architects designed buildings inspired by ancient styles. The cultural life of the kingdom slowly expanded. The French monarchy played an important role in supporting this transformation. Kings and nobles sponsored artists and scholars. They invited thinkers from other parts of Europe to visit the royal court. Libraries grew larger. Manuscripts and books circulated more widely. These changes helped spread new ideas throughout the kingdom. Education also began to develop further. Universities attracted students from many regions. Scholars studied law, medicine, philosophy, and theology. Discussions in classrooms and libraries explored both traditional knowledge and new discoveries. Paris remained one of the most important intellectual centers in Europe. Its university drew students from distant lands who wished to study under respected teachers. Architecture during the Renaissance also reflected changing tastes. New buildings combined medieval traditions with classical inspiration. Large windows allowed more light to enter interior spaces. Decorative details reflected the influence of ancient Greek and Roman designs. Royal palaces and noble residences were redesigned to reflect elegance as well as strength. These architectural changes gradually reshaped the appearance of French cities and countryside. The invention of the printing press also transformed the spread of knowledge. Books could now be produced more quickly and in larger numbers. Scholars no longer depended entirely on handwritten manuscripts. Ideas traveled more easily between cities and countries. Readers gained access to works of philosophy, science, and literature. This technological change helped accelerate the cultural energy of the Renaissance. Despite these developments, daily life for many people remained connected to the land. Farmers continued planting crops each spring. Harvests filled barns in autumn. Village churches remained gathering places for community life. Markets brought together merchants and villagers just as they had for centuries. The rhythms of rural life remained steady. Yet beneath these familiar routines, France was quietly transforming. The kingdom was becoming more centralized. Royal authority continued to grow. Cities expanded. Trade connected regions more closely than before. And the cultural energy of the Renaissance brought new ideas to artists, scholars, and thinkers. This period of renewal would soon lead to even greater changes. French kings would build magnificent palaces. Explorers would sail to distant lands. And the kingdom itself would grow into one of the most influential powers in Europe. But those changes would unfold slowly, step by step, across the centuries that followed. For now, France was entering a new chapter of creativity and recovery, a quiet rebirth after the long shadow of medieval war. As the Renaissance slowly spread across Europe, France also experienced a period of cultural renewal. The kingdom had recovered from the long years of war. Cities were growing once again. Trade connected distant regions, and the royal court began to reflect the artistic spirit of the age. Among the kings who helped shape this transformation, one ruler became especially important. His name was Francis I. Francis I became King of France in the year 1515. He was young, energetic, and deeply interested in art and learning. Unlike many rulers of earlier centuries, he admired the cultural achievements of Renaissance Italy. He believed that France should become a center of artistic creativity and intellectual life. And during his reign, he worked to bring these ideas into his kingdom. The royal court became a place where artists, scholars, and thinkers gathered. Poets wrote verses celebrating the beauty of the natural world. Musicians performed in grand halls. Painters experimented with new techniques of light and perspective. These creative efforts gave the court a vibrant atmosphere. Visitors from across Europe noticed the growing reputation of French culture. Francis I also developed a strong interest in architecture. During this period, many magnificent castles were built along the Loire River. These buildings combined elements of medieval fortresses with the elegance of Renaissance design. Tall towers rose beside wide windows. Decorated stone facades reflected new artistic influences. Gardens surrounded the palaces with carefully arranged paths and fountains. The Loire Valley gradually became known as a region filled with royal and noble residences. Among the many artists invited to France, one figure was already famous across Europe: Leonardo da Vinci. The great Italian painter, inventor, and thinker spent the final years of his life in France. Francis I welcomed him warmly at court. Leonardo brought with him notebooks filled with sketches and ideas. He shared knowledge about painting, engineering, and science. The presence of such a renowned figure reflected the king's commitment to encouraging creativity and learning. Books and learning also flourished during this period. Libraries expanded. Scholars studied classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome. Writers explored new forms of literature. Printing presses produced books that could reach wider audiences. These developments helped spread knowledge throughout the kingdom. The French language itself also gained greater importance. Earlier centuries had often favored Latin for official and scholarly writing. But during the Renaissance, French writers began using their own language more frequently. Poetry, philosophy, and history were increasingly written in French. This shift helped strengthen a shared cultural identity across the kingdom. Life at the royal court was both elegant and carefully structured. Nobles gathered in large halls for ceremonies and celebrations. Feasts were held where musicians performed, and guests shared elaborate meals. Tournaments and sporting events entertained visitors. Court etiquette guided how people dressed, spoke, and behaved. The court became a stage where power and culture were displayed together. Beyond the palace walls, daily life continued across towns and villages. Farmers worked their fields as they had for generations. Merchants traded goods along rivers and roads. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, and household items. The Renaissance brought cultural change, but the rhythms of rural life remained steady and familiar. Yet the ambitions of Francis I extended beyond culture alone. Like many rulers of the Renaissance period, he sought influence in the wider politics of Europe. France competed with other powerful kingdoms. Diplomacy, alliances, and occasional wars shaped the balance of power. The king believed that a strong and cultured France could play a leading role on the European stage. Despite these political ambitions, the artistic achievements of the French Renaissance remained one of the most lasting aspects of the era. Castles built during this time still stand along the Loire Valley. Paintings and manuscripts created under royal patronage survive in museums and libraries. They remind us of a period when creativity and learning flourished across the kingdom. For the people of France, the Renaissance represented a moment of transformation. After centuries shaped by medieval traditions and long wars, the country entered an age of artistic exploration and intellectual curiosity. The royal court encouraged beauty, knowledge, and innovation, and the cultural legacy of that time would influence generations that followed. Yet the calm atmosphere of the Renaissance would not last forever. New religious tensions were beginning to appear across Europe. Different interpretations of faith would soon divide communities, and the Kingdom of France would face a new period of conflict. A conflict not between foreign nations, but within the kingdom itself, the wars of religion. During the Renaissance, France experienced a flourishing of art, learning, and culture. Castles rose along the Loire River. Scholars filled universities. Artists explored new ideas about beauty and knowledge. Yet beneath this vibrant cultural life, deep religious tensions were beginning to grow. These tensions would eventually lead the kingdom into one of the most troubled periods of its history. Across Europe, during the 16th century, religious beliefs were undergoing dramatic change. New interpretations of Christianity spread through books, sermons, and debate. Many people began questioning long-standing traditions within the church. Movements of reform appeared in different regions. One of the most influential of these movements became known as Protestantism. In France, followers of these reform ideas were often called Huguenots. They formed communities in many cities and regions. Some nobles supported the new teachings. Merchants and craftsmen in certain towns also joined the movement. At the same time, many other people remained loyal to the traditional Catholic Church. As a result, the kingdom gradually became divided along religious lines. At first, these differences were expressed through debate and discussion, but over time, tensions increased. Political rivalries between noble families added to the growing conflict. Powerful groups competed for influence at the royal court. Religion and politics became closely intertwined. Disagreements that might once have remained local now spread across the entire kingdom. By the middle of the 16th century, open violence began to appear. Cities sometimes became divided between Catholic and Protestant communities. Armed groups formed to defend their beliefs. small clashes occurred in different regions. These early conflicts marked the beginning of what would later be known as the French Wars of Religion. The wars did not unfold as one single continuous struggle. Instead, they occurred in a series of conflicts over several decades. Periods of fighting were followed by uneasy truces. Negotiations attempted to restore peace, but mistrust remained strong. Each new incident risked reopening the conflict. One of the most tragic events of this period occurred in the year 1572. It became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. During a time of fragile political tension, violence erupted in the city of Paris. Thousands of Huguenots who had gathered in the city were attacked. The violence soon spread to other towns across France. The event shocked observers throughout Europe. It revealed how deeply divided the kingdom had become. Throughout these years, ordinary people often suffered the most. Farmers found their villages caught between opposing forces. Trade routes became dangerous. Cities struggled with shortages and uncertainty. Families sometimes faced difficult choices about loyalty and belief. The long conflict disrupted the stability that France had begun to rebuild after the medieval wars. Despite the turmoil, efforts to restore peace continued. Different kings attempted to balance the competing religious groups. Advisors proposed compromises. Temporary agreements allowed limited religious freedom in certain regions, but lasting stability proved difficult to achieve. Eventually, a new leader emerged who would help bring an end to the long conflict. His name was Henry of Navarre. Henry had grown up among the Protestant Huguenots, but he also understood the importance of uniting the kingdom. After years of struggle, he eventually became King Henry IV of France. Henry IV took a remarkable step in order to bring peace to the country. Recognizing that most of the population remained Catholic, he chose to convert to Catholicism himself. This decision helped reduce tensions and allowed him to gain broader acceptance as king. His famous remark suggested that the unity of the kingdom mattered more than personal religious identity. In the year 1598, Henry IV issued an important decree known as the Edict of Nantes. This document granted limited religious freedom to Protestants within France. It allowed Huguenots to practice their faith in certain areas while maintaining the overall authority of the Catholic Church. The edict did not remove every tension, but it created a foundation for greater stability. After decades of conflict, France finally began moving toward peace. Cities slowly recovered. Trade routes reopened. Villages returned to the quiet rhythms of farming and seasonal work. The kingdom had endured a long period of internal division. Yet, under the leadership of Henry IV, a new era of unity began to emerge. This stability would allow France to grow stronger in the decades ahead. Royal authority continued to expand. New palaces and cities would rise, and eventually, one king would build a court so magnificent that it became famous throughout the world. A court centered around a palace called Versailles, and a ruler remembered as the Sun King. After the long and difficult years of the French Wars of Religion, the kingdom slowly entered a period of greater stability. Under the rule of King Henry IV, peace began to return. The Edict of Nantes allowed a measure of religious tolerance. Trade recovered. Cities rebuilt their markets and workshops, and the countryside returned to the quiet rhythm of planting and harvest. Yet the future of France would soon be shaped by a ruler whose influence would reach far beyond his own lifetime. His name was Louis XIV. Louis XIV was born in the year 1638. Few people at the time could imagine how long his reign would last, or how much it would shape the image of France. At the time of his birth, many people believed the royal family might never have another heir. His parents had waited many years for a child. Because of this, The young prince was sometimes called Louis Dieudonné, which meant Louis the God-given. His birth was seen as a sign of hope for the future of the monarchy. Louis became king at a very young age. When his father, Louis XIII, died in 1643, the boy was only 4 years old. Because he was too young to rule alone, the government was guided by his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, and by a powerful advisor named Cardinal Mazarin. During these early years, France remained a powerful kingdom, but political tensions were still present beneath the surface. One of the greatest challenges during Louis's childhood came during a period known as the Fronde. This was a series of uprisings led by nobles and political groups who opposed the authority of the royal government. For a time, Paris itself became a center of unrest. The young king and his family were forced to leave the city for their safety. These events left a deep impression on Louis. He learned early that royal authority could be challenged, and that maintaining control over the kingdom required careful leadership. When Louis XIV eventually assumed full control of the government, he decided to rule in a very different way from earlier kings. He believed strongly in the power of the monarchy. He believed that the king should guide the direction of the entire state. This idea became known as absolute monarchy. According to this view, the authority of the king stood at the center of the political system. Louis XIV surrounded himself with advisors and ministers who helped manage the complex administration of the kingdom. Taxes were organized more carefully. Trade and industry received royal support. Infrastructure improved as roads and canals connected regions of the country. These policies strengthened the economic power of France. At the same time, Louis understood the importance of symbolism. He wanted the monarchy to appear strong, orderly, and magnificent. Ceremonies at court became carefully organized displays of royal authority. Every detail of court life, from clothing to etiquette, reflected the power of the king. Louis also chose a symbol to represent his reign: the sun. Just as the sun stands at the center of the solar system, Louis presented himself as the central figure of the kingdom. Because of this symbol, he later became known as the Sun King. The royal court itself became an important part of Louis's strategy for governing the nobility. Powerful nobles were encouraged to spend time at court rather than managing independent territories. By participating in the ceremonies and life of the court, they remained close to the king. This helped reduce the possibility of rebellions like those Louis had witnessed during his childhood. To house this grand court, Louis began transforming a hunting lodge located outside Paris. This location would eventually become one of the most famous palaces in the world, the Palace of Versailles. Construction expanded the modest building into an enormous complex. Gardens stretched across the surrounding landscape. Fountains and sculptures decorated carefully designed pathways. The palace itself became a symbol of royal splendor. Inside Versailles, daily life followed a carefully structured routine. Courtiers gathered for ceremonies marking the king's rising in the morning and his retiring at night. Musicians performed during royal celebrations. Artists decorated halls and galleries. Visitors from other countries marveled at the elegance of the court. The palace became a stage where the power of the monarchy was displayed for all to see. Under Louis XIV, France became one of the most influential kingdoms in Europe. Its culture spread through art, fashion, and architecture. Its political power shaped the balance between nations, and its royal court became a model that other rulers attempted to imitate. Yet even during this time of grandeur, life across the countryside continued quietly. Farmers tended their fields. Villages gathered in churches each week. Markets filled with merchants and travelers. The daily rhythms of ordinary life continued beneath the glittering surface of royal power. The reign of Louis XIV would last many decades. long enough for an entire generation to grow up knowing no other king. During those years, Versailles would become the heart of the French monarchy, and the influence of the Sun King would shine across Europe. But the brilliance of that royal court would also create expectations that future rulers might struggle to meet. Expectations that would shape the destiny of France in the centuries that followed. As the reign of Louis XIV continued, the Palace of Versailles gradually became the center of royal life in France. What had once been a modest hunting lodge outside Paris was transformed into a vast and elegant palace. Stone wings stretched across the landscape. Long rows of windows reflected the sunlight. Gardens extended far beyond the palace walls, filled with fountains, statues, and carefully arranged pathways. Versailles was not only a residence. It was the stage upon which the power of the French monarchy was displayed. Each day at Versailles followed a carefully organized routine. From morning until evening, the king's schedule was surrounded by ceremonies. These rituals might seem ordinary today, but for the people of the 17th century, they carried great significance. The life of the king represented the order of the entire kingdom. Every moment of his day became a symbol of royal authority. The day often began with a ceremony known as the King's Rising. At a specific hour, courtiers gathered outside the royal chamber. Only a few were allowed to enter at first. These were the highest-ranking nobles. As the ceremony continued, more people were gradually admitted. They watched as the king prepared for the day. Servants assisted with clothing and preparations. Each action followed precise rules of etiquette. For the nobles present, being invited to participate in this ceremony was considered an honor. It demonstrated their closeness to the king. Even simple acts, such as handing the king a garment, could carry great prestige. Through these rituals, Louis XIV ensured that the nobility remained closely tied to the royal court. Their status depended upon the king's favor. After the morning ceremonies, the king attended meetings with ministers and advisors. Government decisions were discussed. Reports arrived from different regions of the kingdom. Diplomats presented messages from foreign courts. Behind the elegant appearance of Versailles, important political work continued each day. Later, the court often gathered for meals and social events. Large halls filled with nobles dressed in elaborate clothing. Music played softly in the background. Conversations flowed between guests. Meals could be grand occasions. Tables were filled with carefully prepared dishes. Attendants moved quietly through the room, serving the guests. These gatherings allowed nobles to maintain relationships and observe the subtle rules of court life. One of the most famous rooms in the palace became known as the Hall of Mirrors. Visitors often paused there for a moment, simply to look at the endless reflections of light. This long gallery was lined with tall mirrors on one side and windows overlooking the gardens on the other. During the day, sunlight reflected across the polished floors. At night, hundreds of candles illuminated the space. The room hosted celebrations, diplomatic receptions, and royal ceremonies. Visitors often described it as one of the most magnificent halls in Europe. Beyond the palace walls, the gardens of Versailles extended across a vast landscape. Paths lined with trees led to fountains and sculptures. Water flowed through carefully designed channels. Gardeners worked constantly to maintain the beauty of the grounds. Walking through these gardens offered moments of calm and reflection. Even within the grandeur of the royal court, nature remained an important part of the setting. Life at Versailles also included entertainment. Theater performances took place in specially designed halls. Composers created music for court celebrations. Dances and festivals brought color and movement to the palace. Artists, musicians, and writers often found support within the royal court. Their talents contributed to the cultural life of the kingdom. Yet, while the palace glittered with elegance, life outside Versailles remained much simpler. Across the countryside, farmers continued tending their fields. Villages followed the steady rhythm of agricultural work. Markets gathered in town squares. Church bells rang across valleys and hills. For most people in France, the splendor of Versailles existed far from their daily lives. Still, the influence of the palace extended across the entire kingdom. Foreign visitors carried stories of its beauty to distant courts. Other rulers attempted to imitate its style. Versailles became a symbol of the power and prestige of France. It represented the height of royal authority during the reign of Louis XIV. For decades, the palace remained the center of political and cultural life in the kingdom. Its halls echoed with music, conversation, and ceremony. Its gardens reflected the order and beauty that the king wished to project. And within its walls, the daily rituals of court life continued with remarkable precision. But no reign lasts forever. As the years passed, the long rule of the Sun King would eventually come to an end. The world beyond Versailles was changing. New ideas were beginning to circulate across Europe. Ideas about government, society, and the rights of individuals. And in the century that followed, those ideas would lead France toward one of the most dramatic transformations in its history: the French Revolution. During the later years of the 17th century, France stood at the center of European culture and politics. The court at Versailles displayed the grandeur of royal authority. Artists, musicians, and writers contributed to the reputation of the kingdom. Yet, beneath this magnificent surface, a quieter transformation was taking place. New ideas were beginning to spread across Europe. Ideas about knowledge, reason, and the nature of society itself. This period would later become known as the Age of Enlightenment. The thinkers of the Enlightenment believed that human reason could help people better understand the world. Instead of accepting traditions without question, they encouraged discussion and careful examination of ideas. Philosophers wrote books exploring government, science, and morality. Scholars studied nature and mathematics. Writers debated how societies should be organized. Across Europe, these conversations slowly expanded. France became one of the most important centers of Enlightenment thought. In Paris and other cities, intellectuals gathered to discuss philosophy and politics. They met in private homes, in literary salons, and in the libraries of universities. These gatherings allowed ideas to circulate between writers, scientists, and political thinkers. Through discussion, new perspectives developed about the role of government and the rights of individuals. Printing played an important role in spreading these ideas. Books and pamphlets could now reach a wider audience than ever before. Printers produced works discussing science, philosophy, and literature. Readers in cities and towns gained access to writings that explored the meaning of freedom, justice, and knowledge. The exchange of ideas became more active throughout the kingdom. Some Enlightenment thinkers questioned the traditional authority of monarchies. Others examined the structure of society itself. They discussed whether laws should protect the rights of all citizens. They considered how governments might balance power and responsibility. These discussions did not immediately change political systems, but they slowly influenced the way people thought about authority and justice. Scientific discoveries also contributed to the spirit of the Enlightenment. Researchers studied astronomy, physics, and biology. Experiments helped explain natural phenomena that had once seemed mysterious. Observations of the natural world encouraged a belief that knowledge could expand through careful study. Universities and academies became centers of scientific learning. The Enlightenment also influenced literature and art. Writers explored themes of reason and human experience. Satirical works examined the behavior of political leaders and social institutions. Philosophical essays invited readers to reflect on the values that shaped their society. Through books, plays, and essays, ideas reached readers far beyond the royal court. Despite these intellectual changes, daily life for most people in France continued along familiar paths. Farmers cultivated fields. Merchants traded goods in markets. Craftsmen worked in workshops. Churches and local traditions remained important parts of community life. The Enlightenment spread primarily among educated circles in towns and cities. Yet even there, its influence developed gradually. Over time, the ideas discussed by philosophers began to shape broader conversations. Some writers argued that governments should be accountable to the people they governed. Others suggested that laws should apply equally to all citizens. These concepts challenged long-standing assumptions about social hierarchy. Although change came slowly, the discussions continued to grow. Meanwhile, France itself faced increasing financial difficulties. Wars and the cost of maintaining the royal court placed heavy demands on the treasury. Taxes affected different groups within society in unequal ways. Some people began to question whether the existing system was fair. Economic pressures added new urgency to debates about government and reform. By the late 18th century, the combination of financial strain and new political ideas created a powerful atmosphere of change. The intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment had prepared many people to think differently about authority in society. Conversations that had once taken place in quiet salons and libraries now reached wider audiences. The Kingdom of France stood on the edge of transformation. Soon, events would unfold that would alter the course of the nation's history. Crowds would gather in the streets of Paris. Ancient institutions would be challenged. And a revolution would begin that would reshape not only France, but the entire political landscape of Europe. The French Revolution. By the late 18th century, France stood at a moment of profound tension. For generations, the kingdom had been ruled by powerful monarchs. The royal court at Versailles represented the grandeur of the state. Nobles held positions of influence, and long-standing traditions shaped the structure of society. Yet beneath this familiar order, pressures were slowly building. Economic difficulties, political frustration, and new ideas about freedom and equality were beginning to reshape the way many people viewed the world. France faced a serious financial crisis. Years of warfare had placed heavy demands on the royal treasury. The cost of maintaining the royal court and government administration added further strain. Taxes were collected across the kingdom, but the burden did not fall equally upon all groups within society. Many ordinary people struggled under heavy taxation, while some privileged groups paid far less. These imbalances created growing resentment among parts of the population. At the same time, harvest failures in several years brought hardship to many communities. Poor harvests meant rising prices for bread and other essential foods. For families who depended on daily wages, even small increases in food prices could create great difficulty. Markets filled with worried conversations. In towns and villages alike, people spoke about the challenges they faced. The atmosphere across the kingdom became increasingly tense. In 1789, King Louis XVI made an important decision. In order to address the financial crisis, he called a gathering known as the Estates General. This assembly had not been convened for many decades. It brought together representatives from three traditional groups within French society: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, who were known as the Third Estate. Delegates traveled from towns and regions across the kingdom to attend the meeting. Each group carried lists of concerns and proposals from the communities they represented. These documents described hopes for reform and requests for change. Many people believed that the assembly might lead to solutions that could stabilize the kingdom. Yet, as the discussions began, it quickly became clear that the representatives of the Third Estate expected a greater role in shaping decisions. Members of the Third Estate represented the majority of the population. They included lawyers, merchants, and educated citizens from towns and cities. These delegates argued that their voices should carry greater weight. They believed that the people of France deserved a stronger role in determining the future of the nation. Debates within the assembly became intense. Eventually, members of the Third Estate took a bold step. They declared themselves the National Assembly. By doing so, they announced that they represented the people of France rather than a traditional social order. This declaration marked a dramatic shift in political thinking. Authority was no longer seen solely as belonging to the king. Instead, the idea of national representation began to emerge. Shortly afterward, members of the assembly gathered in an indoor tennis court near Versailles. There, they made a solemn promise. They would not separate until a new constitution had been written for France. This moment became known as the Tennis Court Oath. It symbolized the determination of the assembly to create a new political system. News of these events spread quickly across the kingdom. In Paris, crowds gathered to discuss the unfolding developments. Many people feared that the government might attempt to suppress the new assembly. Rumors circulated through the streets. Tension grew as citizens watched the actions of the royal government. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they sensed that something in France was beginning to change. On July 14, 1789, a dramatic event took place in Paris. A crowd of citizens moved toward a fortress known as the Bastille. The Bastille had long been associated with royal authority. Although it held only a small number of prisoners at the time, it symbolized the power of the monarchy. After hours of confrontation, the fortress was taken by the crowd. The fall of the Bastille quickly became one of the most famous moments of the Revolution. Across France, the news of the uprising in Paris inspired further action. Communities began forming local assemblies. Old systems of privilege were challenged. Discussions about rights and representation spread through towns and villages. The revolution had begun. In the months that followed, the National Assembly introduced major changes. Feudal privileges were abolished. Declarations of rights were written. New ideas about citizenship and law began shaping the future of the country. France was entering a period of transformation unlike anything it had experienced before. Yet revolutions rarely follow a calm or predictable path. The years ahead would bring dramatic events, conflicts within the country, and the rise of new leaders. Among them, one young military officer would soon emerge whose name would become known throughout the world: Napoleon Bonaparte. As the French Revolution unfolded, France entered a period of rapid and dramatic change. The old political order had been challenged. The monarchy had been weakened. New forms of government appeared, one after another. For many people, these years brought uncertainty as well as hope. Amid this turbulent time, a young military officer began to rise within the ranks of the French army. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. This island lies in the Mediterranean Sea, not far from the southern coast of France. Corsica had only recently become part of the French kingdom. Napoleon grew up speaking both French and the local Corsican language. From an early age, he showed strong intelligence and determination. His family encouraged him to pursue education. Eventually, he entered military school on the French mainland. At these academies, Napoleon studied mathematics, engineering, and military strategy. He developed a particular interest in artillery. Artillery officers needed careful calculation and technical knowledge. Napoleon's skill in these subjects helped him advance through the military system. When the revolution began, many traditional barriers within the army began to disappear. Talented officers could rise more quickly through the ranks. Napoleon first gained attention during a military campaign in the city of Toulon. At that time, royalist forces opposed to the revolution had taken control of the port with support from foreign powers. French revolutionary troops attempted to retake the city. Napoleon played an important role in planning artillery positions during the battle. His strategy helped the revolutionary army succeed. After the victory, his reputation as a capable officer began to grow. Over the next several years, France faced conflicts both inside and outside its borders. European monarchies feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. Wars broke out between France and several neighboring states. These conflicts created opportunities for ambitious military leaders. Napoleon soon found himself commanding larger forces. One of his most famous early campaigns took place in Italy. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of a French army sent to fight Austrian forces in northern Italy. At the time, his army was poorly supplied and exhausted. Yet Napoleon used bold strategies and rapid movements to defeat opposing forces. Battle after battle, his troops achieved surprising victories. News of these successes spread quickly through France. Napoleon became widely known as a brilliant commander. His victories in Italy brought both military success and political influence. Treaties forced rival states to accept French power in the region. Artwork and cultural treasures were transported to France. The young general returned home as a celebrated hero. Crowds greeted him with admiration. Many people began to see him as one of the most promising figures of the revolution. Yet Napoleon's ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. He understood the importance of political authority as well as military success. France itself remained unstable. The revolutionary government changed several times during the 1790s. Different political groups competed for control. The country longed for stability after years of upheaval. In 1799, Napoleon took a decisive step. With support from allies within the government and the army, he participated in a political takeover known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The existing government was replaced. Napoleon emerged as the leading figure in a new system of rule. He became First Consul of France. Although the title sounded modest, it placed enormous power in his hands. Under Napoleon's leadership, France began to reorganize after the chaotic years of revolution. Administrative reforms improved the efficiency of government. Legal systems were revised and unified. Education and infrastructure received renewed attention. These changes helped stabilize the country. Many citizens welcomed the sense of order that returned to public life. Napoleon's authority continued to grow. In 1804, he took another remarkable step. In a grand ceremony held in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. With this act, the revolutionary era entered a new phase. France once again had an emperor. But the political world created by the revolution had changed the nature of power. Napoleon's rise marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history. His armies would soon march across much of the continent. Kingdoms and empires would be challenged by his campaigns, and the story of France would once again become intertwined with the fate of Europe. But even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the passage of time, and Napoleon's remarkable career would eventually lead to distant battlefields and to one final journey across a frozen land. As the French Revolution unfolded, France entered a period of rapid and dramatic change. The old political order had been challenged. The monarchy had been weakened. New forms of government appeared one after another. For many people, these years brought uncertainty as well as hope. Amid this turbulent time, a young military officer began to rise within the ranks of the French army. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. This island lies in the Mediterranean Sea, not far from the southern coast of France. Corsica had only recently become part of the French kingdom. Napoleon grew up speaking both French and the local Corsican language. From an early age, he showed strong intelligence and determination. His family encouraged him to pursue education. Eventually, he entered military school on the French mainland. At these academies, Napoleon studied mathematics, engineering, and military strategy. He developed a particular interest in artillery. Artillery officers needed careful calculation and technical knowledge. Napoleon's skill in these subjects helped him advance through the military system. When the revolution began, many traditional barriers within the army began to disappear. Talented officers could rise more quickly through the ranks. Napoleon first gained attention during a military campaign in the city of Toulon. At that time, royalist forces opposed to the revolution had taken control of the port with support from foreign powers. French revolutionary troops attempted to retake the city. Napoleon played an important role in planning artillery positions during the battle. His strategy helped the Revolutionary Army succeed. After the victory, his reputation as a capable officer began to grow. Over the next several years, France faced conflicts both inside and outside its borders. European monarchies feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. Wars broke out between France and several neighboring states. These conflicts created opportunities for ambitious military leaders. Napoleon soon found himself commanding larger forces. One of his most famous early campaigns took place in Italy. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of a French army sent to fight Austrian forces in northern Italy. At the time, his army was poorly supplied and exhausted. Yet, Napoleon used bold strategies and rapid movements to defeat opposing forces. Battle after battle, his troops achieved surprising victories. News of these successes spread quickly through France. Napoleon became widely known as a brilliant commander. His victories in Italy brought both military success and political influence. Treaties forced rival states to accept French power in the region. Artwork and cultural treasures were transported to France. The young general returned home as a celebrated hero. Crowds greeted him with admiration. Many people began to see him as one of the most promising figures of the revolution. Yet, Napoleon's ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. He understood the importance of political authority as well as military success. France itself remained unstable. The revolutionary government changed several times during the 1790s. Different political groups competed for control. The country longed for stability after years of upheaval. In 1799, Napoleon took a decisive step. With support from allies within the government and the army, he participated in a political takeover known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The existing government was replaced. Napoleon emerged as the leading figure in a new system of rule. He became First Consul of France. Although the title sounded modest, it placed enormous power in his hands. Under Napoleon's leadership, France began to reorganize after the chaotic years of revolution. Administrative reforms improved the efficiency of government. Legal systems were revised and unified. Education and infrastructure received renewed attention. These changes helped stabilize the country. Many citizens welcomed the sense of order that returned to public life. Napoleon's authority continued to grow. In 1804, he took another remarkable step. In a grand ceremony held in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. With this act, the revolutionary era entered a new phase. France once again had an emperor. But the political world created by the revolution had changed the nature of power. Napoleon's rise marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history. His armies would soon march across much of the continent. Kingdoms and empires would be challenged by his campaigns, and the story of France would once again become intertwined with the fate of Europe. But even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the passage of time, and Napoleon's remarkable career would eventually lead to distant battlefields and to one final journey across a frozen land. After crowning himself emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. His armies had defeated many of the great powers of Europe. Territories across the continent now fell under French influence. New kingdoms were created and governed by Napoleon's allies and relatives. For a time, it seemed as if the emperor's authority might reshape the political map of Europe entirely. Yet, even the most powerful empires eventually face limits. Napoleon's military campaigns continued across many regions. His armies marched through Italy, Germany, and Central Europe. In battle after battle, they demonstrated remarkable speed and coordination. The emperor often directed operations personally. His strategic decisions brought repeated victories. France became the dominant force on the European continent. But maintaining such a vast empire required enormous effort. Troops needed supplies. Armies needed reinforcements. And the territories under French influence did not always welcome their new rulers. In several regions, resistance slowly began to grow. Local populations sometimes opposed the presence of French troops. Conflicts became more difficult to manage as the empire expanded. One of the most important turning points came in 1812. Napoleon launched a massive campaign against the Russian Empire. The army that marched eastward was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers traveled across the plains of Eastern Europe. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. French forces moved steadily deeper into Russian territory. Yet the campaign soon faced unexpected challenges. Russian armies avoided large battles and retreated deeper into their own land. As they withdrew, they destroyed supplies that might have supported the advancing French forces. Fields were burned. Villages were abandoned. The French army continued forward, but the land ahead offered fewer resources. Eventually, Napoleon's army reached the city of Moscow. The city was largely empty. Soon after the arrival of the French forces, fires spread across much of the city. With winter approaching, the emperor faced a difficult decision. Remaining in Moscow offered little advantage, but retreating across vast distances would be dangerous. Napoleon eventually ordered the army to withdraw. The journey westward became one of the most difficult marches in military history. Winter arrived with intense cold. Snow covered the roads. Supplies ran low. Soldiers who had once marched in triumph now struggled to survive the harsh conditions. Many never completed the journey home. The losses from the Russian campaign weakened Napoleon's power. Across Europe, other nations began forming alliances against France. Armies from several countries united to challenge the emperor. New battles followed. Gradually, Napoleon's position became more fragile. In 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. Facing overwhelming opposition, Napoleon agreed to abdicate his throne. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. For a moment, it seemed that his extraordinary career had reached its end. Yet, Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. Many soldiers who had once served under him quickly joined his cause. For a brief period, he regained control of the government. This dramatic return became known as the 100 Days. But the European powers responded swiftly. Another great battle soon followed. The final confrontation took place near the town of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. Napoleon's army faced forces led by the Duke of Wellington and allied commanders. The battle was fierce and uncertain, but by the end of the day, Napoleon's forces were defeated. The emperor's final attempt to reclaim power had failed. After this defeat, Napoleon was sent into exile once more. This time, his destination was far more distant. He was transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the island of St. Helena. This remote island lay thousands of miles from Europe in the South Atlantic. There, far from the battlefields and palaces of his earlier life, Napoleon spent the remaining years of his life. On St. Helena, the former emperor lived under careful supervision. He spent much of his time reflecting on his past campaigns and writing about his experiences. The man who had once commanded vast armies now lived quietly on a distant island surrounded by ocean. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died there at the age of 51. His rise and fall had transformed the history of Europe. Empires had been reshaped. Nations had fought wars that affected entire generations. Yet the story of France did not end with Napoleon. New political systems would emerge. Kings would return to the throne, and the country would continue evolving through the centuries that followed. As the era of great empires passed into memory, the history of France continued its long journey through time. A journey shaped by kings, revolutions, and the quiet persistence of everyday life across the land. And so, after many centuries, the long story we have followed tonight slowly comes to rest. From the fading roads of Roman Gaul to the quiet villages that grew among forests and rivers, history has moved steadily across the land that would become France. Empires rose, kingdoms formed, wars were fought, and generations of people lived their lives beneath changing skies. Yet, through all of these centuries, much of life continued in gentle rhythms. Long before the great palaces of kings, there were fields. Farmers walked across the soil each morning. They planted seeds in the spring. They watched the crops grow beneath warm sunlight. And when autumn arrived, they gathered the harvest. These simple patterns repeated again and again, year after year, century after century. While rulers debated power, the land continued its quiet work. The Roman Empire once stretched across these lands. Its roads connected distant cities. Stone bridges crossed rivers that still flow today. For a time, Roman authority seemed permanent. Yet even that vast empire slowly faded, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual turning of history. Cities changed, new leaders appeared, and the land entered a new age. From that changing world, the Frankish kingdoms emerged. Warriors and farmers shaped a new society. Among them, Clovis united territories that had once been divided. His decisions helped create the foundations of a kingdom that would grow through the centuries. Generations passed, and the story continued. Then came the reign of Charlemagne, an emperor whose influence spread across much of Europe. Under his rule, learning returned to monasteries. Scholars copied ancient texts by candlelight. Ideas from earlier civilizations were preserved. Quiet rooms filled with books helped carry knowledge through the centuries. Beyond those monastery walls, life moved through forests and valleys. Villages stood beside winding rivers. Church bells rang across the countryside. Travelers walked along old Roman roads, and across the land, a medieval world slowly took shape. Castles appeared on hills. Knights rode across fields in service to their lords. Markets gathered in growing towns. Cathedrals rose above city streets, their towers reaching toward the sky. Generations of craftsmen carved stone and glass, creating buildings that still stand today. Then came the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. For decades, France and England struggled for control. Armies marched across fields that had once been peaceful. Cities faced siege. Families endured uncertain times. Yet, even during those difficult years, hope sometimes appeared in unexpected forms. From a small village called Domremy, a young woman named Joan of Arc stepped forward. She believed deeply in the future of her country. Her courage helped lift the siege of Orléans. Her presence inspired soldiers and citizens alike. For a brief moment, the course of the war changed. Her life ended tragically, but her story remained, and her memory became part of the spirit of France. Eventually, the long war ended. Peace returned. Fields were replanted. Cities repaired their walls. The kingdom slowly rebuilt, and with peace came a new period of cultural discovery. The Renaissance brought new ideas. Artists explored beauty and perspective. Scholars studied ancient philosophy. Writers and thinkers shared their ideas through books and conversation. Across the Loire Valley, magnificent castles rose along the riverbanks. The court of France became a center of creativity and learning. Yet history continued to move. Religious conflict divided the kingdom during the wars of religion. Communities struggled to maintain unity. Years of tension tested the strength of the nation. Eventually, leaders worked to restore peace, and France entered another new era. Under Louis XIV, the power of the monarchy reached its greatest display. At Versailles, ceremonies filled long galleries. Mirrors reflected candlelight across marble floors. Nobles gathered to witness the rituals of royal life. The palace became a symbol of grandeur that echoed across Europe. But beyond Versailles, ordinary life remained familiar. Farmers still worked the land. Villages gathered beside church towers. Markets filled with merchants and travelers. The quiet rhythms of daily life continued beneath the brilliance of royal courts. Then came the Enlightenment. Philosophers asked new questions about society. Writers discussed ideas of reason and justice. Books carried these thoughts across cities and universities. Slowly, people began imagining different ways a nation might be governed. These conversations would soon reshape the future of France. In 1789, revolution began. Crowds gathered in Paris. Old institutions were challenged. Declarations of rights were written. The political landscape of the country changed dramatically. France entered a period of intense transformation. Out of that turbulent era, a young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. His armies marched across Europe. Empires shifted. Battles were fought across distant lands. For a time, Napoleon stood at the center of the continent's political life. Yet, even the most powerful rulers eventually face the quiet passage of time. The emperor who once commanded vast armies ended his life far from Europe, on a small island surrounded by ocean, St. Helena. There, the man who had once reshaped the map of Europe spent his final years in reflection. History had moved forward once again. And so the centuries pass. Empires rise, empires fall, kings rule, revolutions begin. But beneath these great events, the land itself remains steady. Rivers continue to flow, fields continue to grow. Villages continue their quiet routines. And now, the centuries grow quiet. The kings, the battles, the great empires of the past all slowly fade into the distance of history. The rivers continue to flow across the French countryside, just as they have for thousands of years. Villages rest beneath the night sky, and the long story of the past settles gently into silence. If these quiet journeys through history help you relax, You are always welcome to return here again. There will always be another story waiting for you, whenever you need a calm place for your thoughts to wander. But for now, there's nothing more you need to follow. No more roads to travel tonight, no more centuries to cross, only the quiet comfort of this moment. So allow your thoughts to drift, slowly, gently, and let sleep arrive. Tonight, as our journey through the history of France slowly comes to its end. And those same rhythms still exist. Somewhere, a river moves quietly beneath the moonlight. Wind moves softly through trees, and the long story of the past rests peacefully in the pages of history. The kings, the knights, the revolutions, the empires, all now belong to memory. And like distant echo, their stories fade gently into silence. So now, allow your thoughts to drift. There is nothing left to follow tonight. The centuries have finished their journey, and the quiet of the present moment remains. Let the centuries grow quiet, and let the calm passage of history carry you, slowly, into sleep.